Let me tell you about a man who knew he was dying. Not the way most of us suspect it. Quietly, in the back of our minds, some distant Tuesday. But the way a farmer knows a storm is coming. By the feel of the air. By the stillness before it. Eamon Calloway knew it the way he knew everything, practically without self-pity, and well enough in advance to do something about it. The year was 1968. The place was a hospital room in a mid-sized Midwestern town, the kind of room that smells of antiseptic and old flowers and the particular silence of people trying not to say what they mean. Eamon was 64 years old. His hands, even flat on the white sheets, looked like they belonged to the outdoors, wide across the knuckles, mapped with old work. Fingers that had fixed engines in February and pulled calves in April and counted seed money on kitchen tables for 30 years. He had a farm, 200 acres, and he had 2 sons, and he had maybe 2 weeks. That was the situation. Now let me tell you about the sons. Reed Calloway was 38 years old, and he walked into rooms the way some men do. Like the room had been waiting for him. He was not a bad man. Understand that. He was smart, and he was capable, and he had his father's eye for land. But he had something his father never had. Hunger for the visible kind of success. The kind people could see from the road. The new truck. The extra acres. The number you could say out loud at the grain elevator and watch other men's faces change. Reed wanted those faces to change. That was the thing about Reed. Noel Calloway was 34. Where his brother filled a room, Noel absorbed one. Quieter, slower to speak, and faster to notice. He had been working alongside his father since he was 9 years old, and somewhere in those 25 years of side-by-side work, something had passed between them that doesn't have a simple name. Call it understanding. Call it patience. Call it the long view. Noel had it. He just didn't know yet how much he would need it. Eamon called them both to the hospital on a Tuesday in March. Outside, the fields were still gray. That particular gray of late winter when the snow is gone, but the green hasn't decided yet. The kind of gray that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. He divided the farm equally, 100 acres each. The north half to Reed, the south half to Noel. Equal in every legal sense. The deed, the equipment value, the standing inventory. He was careful and exact about it, because he was that kind of man. Now here's what you need to understand about that division. Eamon was not naive. He had watched his sons their whole lives. He knew that equal is not the same as identical. He knew that putting 2 men with opposite philosophies into business together would be like mixing diesel and water. You could shake it all you liked, but they would always separate. So he built the separation in from the start. They would each work their own half, independently. No shared accounts, no joint decisions. He had his reasons. After he explained all of this to both of them, calmly, the way you give instructions you've rehearsed, he looked at Reed and said, "Give me a minute alone with your brother." Reed nodded, kissed his father on the forehead, and left. And in the way that Reed always left rooms, you could hear it. The particular energy of a man who has already started thinking about what comes next. Then it was just Eamon and Noel, and the antiseptic smell, and the stillness. Eamon looked at his younger son for a long moment before he spoke. Then he said, "I need to tell you something about your grandfather." Cormac Calloway had been, by all accounts, a decent man and a good farmer. He had built those 200 acres over a lifetime of careful work. Buying in small pieces when others sold. Improving soil others had mined dry. Repairing what others replaced. By 1929, he owned it all, free and clear. No debt, no partners. He had a brother. His name was Fergus. Fergus was the kind of man who could make a bad idea sound not just reasonable, but obvious. He had a deal, a business investment, something to do with a grain operation downstate. He needed a co-signer on a loan, just a formality, just on paper. It would be paid back in 6 months and Cormac would never hear about it again. You can probably guess what happened. Maybe you've even known a Fergus. The business failed, the loan came due, and because Cormac's name was on the paper, the bank took the collateral. All of it. 200 acres that had taken a lifetime to build. Gone in the time it takes to sign your name. Eamon was 14 years old when his father lost that farm. He watched his family become tenants on the land his grandfather had cleared. He spent the next 15 years, working as a hired hand, a tenant farmer, scraping together every dollar that didn't go to rent and food, buying back his family's land one small piece at a time. The last parcel came through in 1944. He was 40 years old before he owned what his father had owned at 30. "I want you to understand what that means," Eamon said. not the numbers. What it means. Noel understood. Then Eamon asked 3 things of him. Not requests. Promises. Keep the old Oliver tractor. The 1948 model that sat in the south barn. Reliable and unglamorous. Built before planned obsolescence was a business strategy. Never borrow money against the land. Hold it, no matter what came. Your brother is going to do well, Eamon said. For a while, you're going to look like the foolish one. I need you to be all right with that. Noel said he would be. Eamon died 11 days later, on a Thursday morning, with both sons in the room and the field still gray outside the window, still holding their breath, still waiting for spring. The inheritance was accepted. The promise was made. But that's not what this story is really about. This story is about what a promise costs, and what it's worth when everything else has a price tag. The division of equipment happened on a Saturday in April, 3 weeks after the funeral. The brothers sat at the kitchen table of the farmhouse, their father's kitchen table, the same one where Eamon had done his accounts for 30 years, the same one where he'd drunk his coffee standing up every morning because he said sitting down to breakfast was something you did when you had nowhere to be. The table felt different now, bigger somehow. The way rooms get bigger when the person who filled them is gone. They had a list. Every piece of equipment on the farm, written out in Eamon's handwriting, with a value beside each one. Fair market value, looked up and confirmed, because Eamon had prepared this the same way he prepared everything. Before anyone asked him to. They went down the list item by item, trading off choices the way you'd pick teams in a schoolyard. Methodical, mostly civil. 2 men who had been raised in the same house by the same father, and had somehow arrived at 38 and 34 as near-perfect opposites. They got to the tractor, the 1948 Oliver 88, green and cream. Or it had been once. Now it was the particular faded color of machinery that has spent decades being useful rather than admired. It ran. It ran well. Noel knew every sound it made, every small adjustment it needed through the seasons, the way you know a working animal. It was on the list at $800. Reed looked at it and said, "Here's what makes sense. We sell the Oliver, split the money, and go in together on a new case. Better horsepower, lower maintenance. We'd own it jointly and schedule around each other." Noel shook his head. "I'm keeping the Oliver. It's 40 years old, Noel. 20 years. And it runs." Reed set his pencil down. "Dad's gone. You understand that? Whatever he said to you in that hospital room, he's gone. We're the ones who have to make a living now." "I know he's gone," Noel said. "I was there." That was the end of the conversation. Reed took his half of the list, stood up, shook his brother's hand with the particular firmness of a man who has decided he's finished explaining himself, and left. Noel sat at the table a while longer. He didn't feel righteous. He didn't feel certain. He felt the weight of a promise in the way you only feel it once the person you made it to is no longer there to hold the other end. He went out to the barn and checked the oil on the Oliver. Now here is what the next 8 years looked like, if you were watching from the outside. Reed moved fast. Within the first year, he borrowed $40,000 against his 100 acres and bought an adjoining 80-acre parcel to the north, land that had belonged to a retired couple who'd been trying to sell for 2 seasons. Good land, fair price, smart move, on paper. By 1971, he had borrowed again. A larger loan this time to buy a new 4-wheel drive tractor, a grain bin complex, and a planter that could cover twice the ground in half the time. He was farming 220 acres by himself, and he had the equipment to prove it. By 1974, he was at 340 acres. He hired a part-time hand in the spring. He was at every farm meeting, every co-op dinner, every conversation at the elevator. He talked about his operation in numbers, bushels per acre, debt-to-asset ratio, land value per acre, trending upward, upward, always upward. The other farmers listened. Some of them nodded. Some of them went home and made calls to their own banks. By 1976, Reed Calloway was farming 900 acres, carrying loans from 3 different lenders, and was, by every visible measure, the most successful farmer in the county. And what was Noel doing? Noel was farming his 100 acres. The same 100 acres his father had left him. The same Oliver in the barn. No new equipment beyond what wore out and needed replacing. And even then, he bought used, paid cash, and kept the receipts in a coffee can on the shelf above the workbench. He grew corn and soybeans on rotation, sold at the elevator like everyone else, kept his costs low and his expectations lower. In 1972, he paid off the last small debt his father had left on the property, a note on a grain bin that had 3 years left on it. He paid it early. The total remaining balance was $4,200. He drove to the bank on a Wednesday afternoon, wrote the check, and drove home. He owned everything, all of it. No liens, no notes, no partners except the land itself. He told no one. The conversation that mattered happened in the summer of 1972, before the payoff, but after the gap between the brothers had grown wide enough to see from a distance. Reed had come by, not to visit exactly, but to borrow a specific wrench size Noel had, and Reed couldn't locate in his own shop. The kind of errand that brings people together without requiring them to admit they wanted to be together. They stood in the barn doorway, the way farm men stand, half in, half out, eyes moving over the yard out of habit. Reed had a new truck. Noel noticed. He didn't say anything. "You know what your problem is," Reed said, not unkindly, the way older brothers sometimes say hard things. "You're farming like it's still his farm." "It is his farm," Noel said. "He's dead, Noel." "The land isn't." Reed looked at the Oliver parked inside the barn and made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You know what Dad was. He was scared. His whole life, he was scared of losing that land. And fear is not a strategy." Noel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He didn't lose it." Reed took his wrench and left. Noel stood in the barn doorway a while after the truck disappeared. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even sure Reed was entirely wrong. He just knew something his brother didn't know yet. That their father's fear had a name, and a history, and a reason. That it hadn't been born from weakness, but from having watched, at 14 years old, what a signed piece of paper could do to a lifetime of work. Noel understood what his father had been teaching. He just didn't know yet if he'd been taught enough. But here's what you need to understand about those 8 years. 1968 to 1976. Both brothers were right. That's the thing nobody tells you about these stories. It's easy to look back now and say Noel was wise and Reed was reckless. But stand in 1972 and look forward, and the picture is not so clear. Land values were rising. Interest rates were manageable. Every farmer who had borrowed and expanded in that decade had, by the numbers, done the right thing. The system was rewarding exactly what Reed was doing. The problem with systems is they don't tell you when they're about to stop. The farm crisis that would break Reed Calloway didn't announce itself. It arrived the way all real trouble arrives, gradually and then all at once. But that part comes in the next chapter, because right now, in the summer of 1976, Noel Calloway owns his 100 acres outright. The Oliver is in the barn with fresh oil. And Reed is 900 acres wide and carrying more debt than their father ever earned in his life. And everything is fine, right up until it isn't. Let me tell you about the way a slow disaster feels from the inside. It doesn't feel like a disaster at first. It feels like a bad season. Then, it feels like 2 bad seasons. Then it feels like a pattern you keep telling yourself is temporary, right up until the morning you sit down with a piece of paper and a pencil, and you do the arithmetic, and the arithmetic doesn't lie to you anymore. That was Reed Calloway's 1983. But to understand 1983, you need to understand what happened in the years just before it. Because the farm crisis didn't begin on any one day. It was assembled, piece by piece, over years, by forces larger than any one farmer, in offices far from any field. Interest rates climbed through the late 1970s like a slow flood. A loan that had cost a farmer 6% in 1972 cost him 14% by 1980, and then 18% by 1981. At the same time, grain prices, which had run high through most of the 70s, which had made all that borrowing feel not just reasonable, but smart, began to fall. And land values, which every lender had used as collateral, which every farmer had used as the foundation of his net worth, began to follow the grain prices down. The math that had worked in one direction began, methodically, to work in the other. Reed held on longer than most. That is worth saying plainly, because it is true, and because it mattered to him, and because the kind of man Reed was, determined, proud, relentlessly capable, did not go down without a fight. He sold the furthest parcels first. He renegotiated with one lender to pay off another. He cut his hired help. He worked 16-hour days through the planting seasons of 1981 and 1982, doing alone what he'd once had help for, driving himself the way a man drives himself when stopping means admitting something he isn't ready to admit. By the spring of 1983, he was farming 400 acres, less than half of his peak. The rest had been sold or surrendered. And on the 400 acres he still held, he was 6 months behind on his loans. The total debt was $850,000. The land, at current depressed values, was worth roughly half that. He was 53 years old. He called Noel on a Sunday evening in June. Noel was in the kitchen when the phone rang, eating supper alone, the radio on low, the kind of quiet evening that a man who has lived by himself for a long time stops noticing as lonely and starts to recognize simply as his life. He picked up on the second ring. Reed's voice on the other end was different, not broken. Reed was not a man who broke easily, but compressed, the way a voice gets when a person has been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and has finally, at the last possible moment, set it down. "I need to talk to you," Reed said. "All right," Noel said. "Not like this. Can I come over?" He came the next morning. He sat at the same kitchen table where they had divided the equipment 15 years before. He had a folder with him, papers, letters from the bank, a summary his accountant had prepared. He set it on the table but didn't open it. He already knew every number in it. He told Noel everything, the full picture, plainly, without softening it. The $850,000, the land values, the timeline the bank had given him. He was going to lose all of it. The house, the equipment, the remaining acreage, at auction, everything. Everything except one piece. The East 100, Reed said. That was what they'd always called the original parcel on the east side of the property. The 100 acres that had been in the family since their grandfather Cormac built it. The heart of what Eamon had spent 15 years clawing back from the bank. The original ground. The bank was auctioning it separately in 3 weeks. Reed looked at his brother across the table. Noel could see what it cost him to say the next sentence. Could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his hands rested flat on the folder like he was physically holding himself still. "I need you to buy it," Reed said, "at the auction. Buy it and keep it in the family. I'll pay you back. Whatever it takes, whatever timeline, I'll pay every dollar back." Noel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you something Dad told me." And at that kitchen table, 23 years after Eamon had first told it in a hospital room, Noel told his brother the story of Cormac and Fergus. The full story. The loan, the co-signature, the paper, the 14-year-old boy watching his family become tenants on their own land. The 15 years of working as a hired hand to buy it back one piece at a time. Reed listened without speaking. His face, as the story settled into him, went through something Noel had never seen on it before. Not shame, exactly. Not quite grief. Something older than both of those. Recognition, maybe. The particular look of a man who has just understood something he should have understood a long time ago, and who is honest enough with himself to know it. "He never told me that," Reed said quietly. "No," Noel said. "He told me." A long silence. "Will you be there?" Reed asked. "At the auction?" "I'll be there," Noel said. The auction was on a Thursday morning in late July. Hot. The kind of flat Midwestern heat that sits on everything and doesn't move. There were perhaps 40 people gathered at the edge of the East 100. Farmers, bankers, a few land speculators from the city, a couple of men in clean boots who had driven up from Minneapolis and stood slightly apart from everyone else, consulting papers, speaking to each other in low voices. Reed stood to one side. He did not bid. He had nothing to bid with. He watched. Noel had $42,000 in savings. He knew the land was worth more than that, at depressed prices, maybe $55,000 or $60,000, and the Minneapolis men would know the same. But $42,000 was what he had, in cash, built dollar by dollar over 15 years of farming 100 acres without borrowing a cent. The bidding opened at $20,000. It moved quickly at first. The Minneapolis speculator was aggressive early, pushing the number up in large jumps, the way buyers do when they want to discourage the room. 25, 30, 35. Noel bid steadily, calmly, the way his father had taught him to do anything that mattered. 40,000. The speculator went to 43. Noel had $2,000 left. He could go to 42, and then he was done. He raised his hand. 42,000. The speculator looked at him, looked at his clean shirt, his plain face, the lack of any entourage, made a calculation, went to 44. Noel stood still. He had nothing left to bid. And then a hand went up beside him. The man's name was Dale Bruder. He farmed the property directly to the south of Noel's 100 acres. He had known Eamon Calloway for 30 years. He was 61 years old and had the weathered look of a man who had spent all 61 of them outside. He bid $2,000, his own money, without discussion, without condition, without being asked. Later, walking to his truck, Noel tried to thank him. Dale shook his head. "Your father pulled my tractor out of a ditch in the winter of 1951, he said. "I'd been trying to pay that back for 30 years. Consider it settled." That was all he said. The rest of the auction lasted 4 hours. Noel stayed for all of it. He stood beside his brother and watched the equipment go. The big 4-wheel drive tractor first, then the planter, then the grain bins sold for salvage value. He watched the house sell to a young couple from town who had been renting and were thrilled at the price, and had no idea and could not have been expected to know what the price represented in a man's life. Reed watched all of it without speaking. When it was over, when the last buyer had shaken hands with the auctioneer and the last truck had pulled away down the gravel road, Reed sat down on the tailgate of Noel's truck and put his face in his hands. He didn't make a sound. He just sat there, face in his hands, for a long time. Noel stood beside him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because some things have to be felt all the way through before they become something a person can carry. The East 100 was saved. Everything else was gone. And that, right there, is the part that matters. Not the winning, not even the saving, but the cost of it, and who paid it, and why, and what it meant that a man named Dale Bruder had held a $2,000 debt of gratitude for 32 years and had never once mentioned it until the exact moment it was needed. That's the part that stays with you. Let me tell you how a proud man learns something. Not quickly, not cleanly, not in a single conversation or a single season. A proud man learns the way land recovers after a hard year. Slowly, from the inside out, in ways you can't see until one morning you look out across the field and something has quietly changed. And you realize it's been changing for a while. You just weren't watching closely enough. That was Reed Calloway in the years after the auction. Noel brought him home the evening of that Thursday in July. No ceremony to it, no speech. He simply said, "On the drive back from the auction, you'll stay in the East Room." And Reed nodded and looked out the window at the passing fields. And that was that. The East Room had a single bed, a dresser, and a window that faced the barn. Reed had not slept in that house since he was a young man. He lay in the dark that first night and listened to the particular silence of a farm at night. The insects, the distant movement of animals, the occasional creak of an old house settling into itself. And he felt, for the first time in perhaps 20 years, completely still. Not at peace. Not yet. But still. In the morning, Noel knocked on the door at 5:30 and said breakfast was ready. Noel gave his brother work, not charity. Work, real work, with real responsibility, and equal say in every decision. They divided the 200 acres between them the way their father had once divided the original farm. Equally, practically, without sentiment about who had been right and who had been wrong. And on the third morning, when Noel needed to run the south field, he handed Reed the keys to the Oliver. Reed looked at the keys in his palm. "You're serious," he said. "It's the only tractor we have," Noel said, and walked back to the house. Reed stood in the barn for a long moment. The Oliver sat there the way it always had, patient, faded, indifferent to being mocked or admired. He climbed up, adjusted the seat the way his father had taught him to adjust it 35 years ago, and turned the key. It started on the first try. He sat there for a moment with the engine running beneath him. That old, reliable sound, unimpressive and steady as a heartbeat. And something moved through him that he couldn't have named and didn't try to. He put it in gear and drove it out into the morning. The first year was about survival, learning the rhythms of a smaller operation after decades of scale. Relearning what it felt like to do the work yourself, without delegation, without a hired hand to call. Reed was 53 years old and in good physical condition, but there is a difference between the fitness of a man who manages and the fitness of a man who works. And Reed felt that difference in his back and his hands every evening for the first several months. He didn't complain. Noel noticed that. Whatever else had been stripped away by the crash, Reed's work ethic was intact. The man was in the field at first light and back at dark, and he relearned the specific intelligence that comes from doing the same task repeatedly until your body knows it better than your mind does. The second year, something shifted. It was small at first, the way Reed started watching the soil instead of just the equipment, stopping to kneel at the edge of a row and work a handful of dirt between his fingers the way their father used to. Asking Noel questions, not aggressive questions, the kind designed to challenge, but genuine ones. The kind a student asks a teacher. How do you know when to hold corn instead of selling at harvest? How much do you keep in reserve before winter? Why did Dad always plant the south field last? Noel answered each one without making a thing of it. He understood what was happening. His brother was not just learning to farm 200 acres. He was learning something their father had tried to teach him 40 years ago, that he had not been ready to hear. You can only learn certain things by losing them first. The conversation happened on a September evening in 1986, 3 years after the auction. They were sitting on the porch after supper. The light was that particular late September gold that makes everything look like a painting of itself. The fields were harvested. The bins were full. The season's work was done. 2 men on a porch, the way men have sat on porches at the end of harvest since there have been harvests. Reed had a glass of water in his hand. He was looking out at the field and not saying anything. And then after a long silence, he started talking. Not explaining. Not arguing. Talking the way a man talks when he has been carrying something long enough that he no longer needs to be asked. He talked about the borrowing. About how it had felt. The rush of it. The expansion. The particular pride of watching your operation double and double again. How the numbers had become a kind of language he spoke to the world. How he had translated his father's silence as fear rather than wisdom. How he had looked at Noel's 100 acres and seen smallness, limitation, a man too cautious to really live. I thought more meant better, he said. I thought growth was the same thing as strength. He was quiet for a moment. I had 900 acres and I was more afraid than you ever were with 100. I just didn't know that's what it was. I thought I was being bold. He turned and looked at his brother. I owe you more than the land, Noel. I know that. Noel looked at the field. You don't owe me anything, he said. Dad paid it forward. Dale paid it sideways. We're all just passing something along. They sat there until the light was gone. In 1988, exactly 20 years after their father had divided the farm at that hospital bedside, Noel drew up papers and sold Reed back his half of the East 100, at cost. No interest, no conditions. The price was $22,000, half of what Noel had paid at auction, minus Dale Bruder's contribution, which Noel considered separately settled. Reed paid it over 4 years, in equal installments, every one of them on time. When the last payment cleared and the deed transferred, Noel drove to the county clerk's office himself to file the paperwork. He came home, made coffee, and set 2 cups on the kitchen table. Reed came in from the field, saw the cups, and understood without being told. They were equal partners again, legally, exactly as their father had intended. 200 acres, 2 brothers, 20 years later. Now it is the present. Reed Calloway is 84 years old. He still walks the fields in the morning, though he moves more carefully now, the way men move when they have learned to pay attention to the ground beneath them. The south field belongs to his grandson, who farms it the way Noel farmed it, carefully, without debt, with the long view. The north field is leased to a neighbor's son who was taught to farm by his own father, who was taught by his. Every Christmas, the family gathers at the farmhouse. At some point in the evening, after supper, after the children have run themselves to exhaustion, and the adults are sitting with their coffee and the particular warm weight of a full house around them, Reed tells the story. He tells it the way Eamon told it. The whole thing. Cormac and Fergus. The co-signature. The 14-year-old boy watching the farm go. The 15 years of tenant farming. The deathbed division. The auction. The Oliver in the barn. And at the end, every year, he says the same thing. He says, debt is a chain. It doesn't look like a chain when they put it on you. It looks like freedom, like room to move, like room to grow. But the longer you wear it, the heavier it gets. And one day you reach the end of it and find out how short it really was. He pauses. Your great-grandfather knew that. Your grandfather spent 15 years learning it. I spent 20. Whatever it costs you to learn it, pay it. Pay it early. The lesson is worth more than the land. The children listen. The adults who have heard it before listen again. The room is quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something true is being said. And then someone refreshes the coffee, and the children start up again, and the evening moves on the way evenings do. Out in the barn, the Oliver sits. 1948. Green and cream mostly. A few spots where the paint has gone to bare metal, buffed smooth by decades of hands resting in the same places. The engine is in good order. Reed sees to that himself still because some things you don't hand off to someone else. The case tractor Reed bought on credit in 1971 is gone. Sold for scrap 40 years ago. There is no record of it anywhere except in old loan documents in a box in the county clerk's archive. The Oliver runs. It will probably outlast everyone who remembers why it matters, which is exactly the point.